Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I hope everybody has had the chance to enjoy the late summer days with friends and family before we move into the fall. My name is Jason Larson, and I'm the head of content here at the International Institute for Analytics, and I'm your host for today's session. And welcome to today's webinar, Communicating Analytics Value Before Budget Season Hits. In case you're new to the International Institute for Analytics, more commonly known as IIA, we are an independent, strategic, outcome-focused data and analytics advisory firm. We're practitioners working with practitioners. Analytics is all we do, and we do it with a relentless focus on measurable impact. Visit our homepage for more information about who we are and how we support data and analytics leaders in making the difficult and necessary transition to advanced analytics and AI. All right, before we dive into the presentation, let's go over a few housekeeping items. First, take a minute and register for our annual analytics symposium in Pittsburgh, October 29th through the 30th. Join our community of top data and analytics teams, paving the way for their organizations as we explore current trends, challenges, and best practices in enterprise analytics and AI. There should be a link to that registration page in the chat. And for today's session, we encourage you to submit questions or comments via the chat window, and we'll make sure to save time at the end of the session to address as many questions as possible. Really the dialogue and questions that you bring to the table add tremendous value to these sessions. That's what we're looking for. It makes you an active participant. It brings some energy to the speakers. So don't be shy. Converse as a group in the comments, share resources, send us your questions, and that level of engagement really generates more takeaways for us all. Keep in mind a recorded version of this webinar and the slides will be available after the presentation. All right, so without further ado, we are delighted to welcome Scott Friesen as our featured speaker today. Scott is an IIA expert and Executive Vice President of Strategic Analytics at Echo Global Logistics. Scott has supported IIA's clients on a variety of topics in one-on-one conversations, and he's really a go-to expert for us on questions related to capturing and communicating analytics and AI value. He brings a lot of experience and powerful frameworks to the table on this subject, some of which he'll discuss today. And also, I might add, Scott is just a lot of fun to talk to, which is a bonus for sure. I always enjoy the opportunity to connect with Scott. So beyond this webinar, we encourage you to leverage the following resources to help you reframe value conversations and align outcomes with business priorities. First, download our new ebook, which is a practical guide to measuring and communicating the true value of enterprise analytics. And take a minute and visit our ROI resource hub, which has additional tools and resources, including key takeaways from real expert exchanges. And last but not least, we encourage you to book a free 30-minute consultation with an IIA expert, including Scott, to discuss your top challenges around ROI. And at IIA, we really believe that analytics leaders need a new framework that breaks from traditional finance models to capture the true value of analytics and AI and effectively communicate it to the business. Scott's session will explore how to build a portfolio of work that balances quick wins with long-term impact. He'll teach us how to educate below the waterline, and he'll help us really think like a marketer, promoting the good work your team has produced that has improved the business. So with that said, Scott, I'll let you take it from here, my friend.
Thanks so much, Jason. All right, so step one, making sure everybody can hear me all right. And step two, sharing my screen, making sure that's coming through. So if we've got steps 1 and 2, I think we're good to go. So just a quick word on my title, which is a little bit unusual. We don't have a chief analytic officer or chief data officer at our firm formally, but I did want to mention the reason for the title Strategic Analytics. When I joined the company, I got an opportunity to help shape the role. I was actually originally brought in as a consultant before I came in full time. And one of the reasons why I wanted to go with the title strategic analytics was twofold. Number one, I only wanted to work on stuff that would move the needle in terms of business performance. And so one of the things that strategic analytics was meant to do as a title was give me an ability to push back against the questions that may come that are just sort of interesting, but not necessarily valuable. For those of you that work at large firms, you may have to contend with that with certain internal executive customers of your services. And it can be challenging to sort of manage that. And then the second thing, so that was sort of the first thing I was after with that title. The second thing I was after is I didn't want to get pigeonholed into a single department or group. I wanted to make sure that we could move across the entire enterprise and go to wherever the value was. So that's just a couple words on the unusual title there. So just to give you a really brief primer on my background, and I mostly point this out less about credibility and more about what informs my perspective. I've worked for different size companies in different spaces. And so when I talk about the frameworks, I really do believe they are applicable across a very wide variety of industries and company sizes and types and complexities. So the first, I'll point out, I worked for Best Buy for most of a decade. It's a very large, multinational, highly matrixed organization. It had 150,000 employees while I was there and over $40 billion and in multiple countries. Then I went on to work for a mid-sized, high-growth domestic retailer, Ulta Beauty, based in the greater Chicago market. And then I did a consulting stint with a small privately held independent advertising agency that owned an analytic consultancy. And so that was a diverse client mix, and I got to really get a lot more familiar with marketing analytics, marketing performance, but not only that, customer insights and things like that across the different types of customers and different kinds of industries. And then since then, I've come to Echo. I've now been here going on a decade. We are a mid-sized, high-growth North American transportation logistics provider. Basically, we move freight, but we are what's called a 3PL, or third-party logistics provider. That means that we move freight on other people's equipment. We don't actually employ truck drivers or own trucks, but rather we play as a connection intermediary between shippers that need to move freight and carriers that need freight to move. And so when I say mid-size, we're around 4 to 4.5 billion in revenue. We were formerly a public company on the NASDAQ. We were taken private about 3.5 years ago by the Jordan Company, a private equity group, which has really been a very positive experience for us. I know that folks have very different kinds of experiences with private equity. Ours has been a very positive experience. But we're about 3,000 employees, and as I said, about $4 billion, just to give you a sense of size. When I joined the company, we were right around 1 billion. So we're about 4 times the size we were when I joined back in about a decade ago. The last thing I want to point out that definitely informs my perspective on all of this is the digitization of industries. It's really easy for that to be a buzzword, but I've lived sort of right up close and intimately with multiple industries. In fact, before I was at Best Buy, before I was sort of in corporate America, I actually, when I graduated from undergraduate school, moved to New York City to get into the music industry. And I point that out because I was in the music industry when the first version of Napster came out, when MP3 was not just a file type, but a website called mp3.com. And so the digitization of music and the disruption that was creating to the music industry was incredibly present and dramatic. Then I was at Best Buy when the number one competitor in the world went from Walmart to Amazon. Then when I was just happened to be at the Richards Group when the number of hours per day spent on screens, basically this device, the smartphone, eclipsed television as the most time spent on screens. So another massive digital transformation in the advertising space. And now in logistics, I am a participant in helping to drive a tremendous amount of efficiencies and automation and digitization along with my colleagues and our operations group and technology groups um, to really sort of transform our company and our industry. So that's just a little bit about me and my background. So I want to start with the simplest framework that I have and the one that will sort of be our sort of guiding force throughout the rest of this session. Whenever I have someone come to me and ask for career advice, um, if I know the person on a personal level or I've worked with them, then I'm happy to try to provide, specific advice specific to that person, talk to them about what they're looking to accomplish in their career. But if I don't know anything about them, or if I get a young person who just, knows me more by title than by person, and they ask to set up time, and they ask me for career advice, I pretty much always give the same advice. It's two steps. Number one, do good work. Number two, tell people about the work. And it's remarkable to realize how frequently folks are not doing one or the other of those. But but to really advance one's career, I believe you need to do both. And by extension, that is also true. The same advice for careers that I would give to advancing your function. So if you are responsible for data or analytics or data science or even AI at your firm, I would argue this is the same mantra you want to have, which is step one, are we doing good work? Step two, if we are doing good work, are we telling people about the work? And I do want to note that I've chosen the words very carefully here. I didn't say tell people about yourself. I said tell people about the work. And that's really an important sort of principle. It helps separate the ego or the sort of really obvious ambition that can be off-putting to some folks, either as something they don't want to do themselves or something that people don't want to receive very well. If you're talking about the work and the work is good and interesting, then there's a lot more openness, both to present about it as well as to have it heard and received. So that's sort of the groundwork. And now we're going to get into each of those two things in a lot more detail over the next half hour. So section one, do good work. What does that mean? Well, it means, first of all, do work that matters and perform it well. So I want to touch on a little bit about what I consider to be good work or some of the guiding principles I use to make sure we are doing work that matters at Echo. So my goal for our team, and I present these next couple slides to every person who joins my team in orientation, is my goal is audacious. It's to make every single decision at Echo at every level from the CEO to the rep better. When I say rep, I'm talking about sales reps, operations reps. Those are the folks on the front line that are really making the freight move, making our clients happy, making our carriers happy, et cetera. And so I'm referring to the sort of entire hierarchy that's available for improvement. I also choose the word better deliberately. It's a little bit squishy, and I do that on purpose. Better can mean a lot of different things. It can mean the same decision faster. It could be automating a decision. It could be a better informed decision on something that's complex. It could be better measured, better predicted. There's a lot of different ways that you can enhance decision making, and all of those I consider to be sort of within the scope of what we're trying to accomplish. So how do we know if we're successful? Well, we used to be a public company, and when you're a public company, stock price is typically one of the sort of ultimate yardsticks that's used. But as I mentioned, we were taken private, so stock price is no longer part of that. Instead, it's really about profit growth. And so that's one thing, is that we're driving profitable growth. The second thing is that we are moving more loads per person per day than we have in the past. That's really about efficiency. And in our industry in particular, and I'm sure this is true in many of your industries, we're under tremendous pressure to continuously evolve and add efficiencies to our business. And so this is one that really is sort of a call to action by the members of my team, which is, are we making sure that we can either build decisions into systems, automate things, or create situations where we make the reps, the folks that are actually doing the work, sort of bionic and make it possible for them to move far more loads per person per day than they have been able to in the past. The fourth and final one is sort of more of a qualitative thing. It's something that I'm always listening for when I'm in meetings, especially with leadership, and someone says, "Well, we don't really know X." Um, I am always intrigued to see if we can go from not knowing that thing to knowing that thing. And so, to me, if we are successful over the span of years, the phrase "we don't know X" is either uttered less and less often, or at least it's uttered about new things, that we don't stay in a state of not knowing for longer periods of time. So those are some of the success criteria. Now, when I talk about profitable growth, this is sort of the framework that's happening in my head. The gray circles are basically where profit growth comes from. It comes from gross profit, depending on what industry you're in, you might call that margin. We call it gross profit. It's the difference between our revenue and our cost of goods. So we're looking for revenue growth. We're looking for margin rate growth. That generates GP, or gross profit growth. And then we're looking for percent cost reduction. So our carrier costs are a huge proportion, our headcount efficiency, and then all other. Now, what's important, and the reason I have this right-hand side here with the blue, is that at lots of companies, work and projects are talked about through the lens of either products or departments. So in our business, LTL is less than truckload, TL is full truckload. Those are sort of different modes of transportation. There might be work going on for sales and operations, for MT, which is managed transportation. Again, it's a big department at our firm, or other smaller departments, HR, marketing, et cetera. And so my point of this is that typically the work is classified internally along those blue boxes. So my team is working on LTL margin enhancement, or it's working on recruiting for HR to improve our yield on the quality of the candidates we get. But what I'm doing in my head is I'm asking myself, where in these gray bubbles is this work going to contribute? Because if it's not, I'm gonna try to give it less time and attention. I'm gonna lean in harder to stuff where I believe we're gonna move the needle on the gray bubbles. So it's discussed in the blue box terms, but it's evaluated in my head in the gray bubble terms. Now, that said, I know many of you may work for public companies, so I just wanted to show my prior version of this, which was a higher stock price. And you'll notice it's exactly the same, except at the head here, before, profit and cash flow growth basically lead to actual performance. And the older I've gotten in my career, the more I've come to recognize the reality that many stock prices are driven only somewhat on actual performance. They're also largely driven on perceived performance. Now, depending on who you talk to, some folks talk about storytelling, they talk about the PE multiple, they talk about these different things, but where does that leave us? Because, I like to think of the function that I run as a sort of empiric function. We're all about, the facts and moving things measurably. But I have become a little more patient with the fact that sometimes part of what we're doing, in addition to actually trying to materially move the needle, is show that the way that we're moving the needle has particular sophistication, or particular difficulty for a competitor to replicate. And so with that can come from time to time something that I refer to as analytic theater. So what I mean by that is, oh, it's this incredibly cool graph, it's this incredibly interactive, um, website, or it's some sort of predictive model that sort of has a wow factor. And while I tend to be extremely focused on delivering actual performance growth, I don't completely rule out the fact that sometimes you can get a bump in a stock price from also leaning into some of the perceived performance on top of the actual performance. So just wanted to acknowledge that. The other thing that's important, and again, we're still, like, all of these slides so far are slides that I literally do in my orientation with every member that joins my team so they understand what we're trying to accomplish. We have to balance our work between driving specific analytic outputs, many of which are R&D, because we not only don't know how we're going to do it, in some cases, we don't know if we can do it when we start the work, which is really fun. But to balance that with creating sort of an increasingly robust foundation and infrastructure so that we can answer questions faster, more accurately, more completely, and at increasing levels of complexity. So many of you may have, data quality challenges, you may have data architecture challenges, you may have data access challenges, you may have tool challenges, et cetera. So all of those would fall in that basket of creating a more robust foundation and infrastructure to be able to sort of do things better and faster. And the important thing here on this slide is really the word balance, that it's not one or the other, it's both. And the question is how much effort is going into one versus how much effort is going into number two. And my rule of thumb is that generally speaking, the effort going into number one needs to be at least double the effort going into number two. If you say, hey, we're going to build this giant data lake and we're not going to add any value for the next 18 months until that's done, that's a really tough line to sell. Not impossible, depends on your company, but it's tough. Meanwhile, if you say, we're going to work on this data lake, but in the meantime, there's a series of other value that we can create for the organization while we're waiting for that new, better infrastructure to come along, it's a much more compelling case, at least in my life experience. All right. So quick tactical detour. We've been sort of talking strategically for a bit, and I want to talk a little bit about, Jason mentioned this in the opening, I want to talk a little bit about a portfolio approach to what kinds of projects you're working on. So let me just set the table in terms of what I'm dealing with in terms of resources. So I have a team of 16 plus 1 or 2 summer interns every summer. 5 members of my team have a routine process that they're responsible for. They're basically responsible for pricing support for RFPs, and we'll handle probably about 1,300 this year. So it's a continuous sort of pipeline of a repeatable process that comes in. And so those folks' primary responsibility is making sure that that pipeline of sales opportunities is going smoothly and that they're providing outstanding support to the sales organization. So they have a little bit of headroom from time to time for taking on ancillary projects, but most of the time they're busy. So what that means is I basically got roughly, call it 12 FTE capacity. No, I didn't mess up the math. I'm basically saying I get a little piece of those folks that work on the routine processes there. But I've got roughly 12 full-time equivalent capacity to allocate. And the most important thing that I think about in terms of what we're going to work on, besides the value piece, is that I want a mix of what I refer to as on my team, singles, doubles, triples, and home runs. What does that mean? Basically, a single is, and apologies for those of you not from the US who aren't as familiar with baseball, but basically has to do with how many bases you're making it around. In baseball, you can sort of think of it as, how strong was the hit that the player made. A single is basically a light piece of work that can be done in days up to maybe a couple of weeks. Doubles would be a couple of weeks up to a month. Triples would be, call it something that takes between 1 month and 6 months to complete. And home run is something that's going to take longer than 6 months to complete. And typically the value needs to be commensurate with that sort of time commitment. That sort of gets to the value piece that we were speaking about before. But the reason why I think this balance is very important is if you only have singles, if you're heavy at one end, then the good news is you're sort of constantly producing value for the organization. That's the good news. The bad news is none of those things are really substantial in terms of moving the needle in a big way in terms of organizational performance. If, on the other hand, you've only got home runs, the good news is you've got huge impact when those things get done, but it can be very long periods of time before anything actually comes out of the team. By having this mix of singles, doubles, triples, and home runs, it basically ensures that there are some really big needle moving things that are happening, but at the same time, there's a regular pace of output coming out of the team in terms of, making a difference to the business. And so I typically map our activities. By the way, if you don't want to use the baseball metaphor, you can very easily use the IT metaphor of t-shirt sizing. Some of you may be familiar. Small, medium, large, extra large is a way that you can also refer to these things in terms of how much effort's going to go into it. And I point out this image down here at the bottom, which is um, basically a classic sort of consulting 2x2 matrix on what's the financial benefit of this thing and what's the difficulty or cost of this thing. And so again, you're sort of looking for that balance so you don't have everything just in one quadrant. Okay. One more thing. I want to talk about interns, and again, with apologies, I'll continue my baseball metaphor. For those of you familiar, stealing a base is a riskier moment, sort of a more aggressive choice offensively. And so the risk is that the runner can get thrown out, but the reward is that they can advance a base, which increases the chances that they'll score a run. And by the way, respect to Ricky Henderson, who passed away. He was one of the greatest of all time as a base stealer in the US. But uh, why do I talk about base stealers in the context of interns? Because interns are often, at least for a long time for me, seen as this sort of, I don't mean this insultingly, but sort of throwaway work. It was work that maybe they're good enough to actually produce something in the summer. Maybe they're not. It's very hard to know in advance if they're going to produce something substantive. But what I've figured out in the last several years is that the good news about interns is that if you put in on something that's a little bit audacious, that's a little bit out there, um, no one's going to question assigning intern resources to a project. So that thing that you think might be interesting or might work out, but it's kind of more risky as to whether or not it's beneficial. Um, if you would assign an intern to that, then no one's really going to ever question the ROI. And so we've started identifying some projects that are a little bit further out in the periphery because we're not sure if they're going to add value. We think they might add value, but we want to sort of find out. And having the interns work on those projects, in addition to the fact that it sort of de-risks it for the core team, also is super interesting work typically for the intern. So it's really a win-win situation that we've been having work on some of those kinds of projects in the summer. All right, so with that, back to strategy frameworks. So we've talked about, the portfolio of work. We've talked about doing good work and sort of defining it through the lens of value based on the sort of value bubbles. The next thing I want to talk about is defining analytics. And certainly it's very interesting now with AI. AI is so interesting because it overlaps, but it's not identical to all of the sort of analytic arts and sciences. But I still think it's very important to try to own the narrative within your firm as to what analytics actually means. So one of the things that I've tried to do is make sure that our company has an intuition about what that term means that's broader than, for example, just reporting. I've had situations where I've been at conferences and I've met someone and they said, "What do you do?" And I say, "Oh, I'm in analytics." And they say, "Oh, I really love reporting." And to me, that reporting is just the tip of the iceberg on what analytics means. Um, and so let me start with my definitions here. So analytics is a gerund. Um, does anybody know what a gerund is? That's an actual question to the audience. Let me see if I can actually see anybody. I'm looking in the chat to see if anyone wants to answer. Yes, it's a verb acting as a noun. Nice job, Dean Gill. Okay, that's right. It's a noun that's made out of a verb. So for example, swimming is a gerund. So so why do I say that analytics is a gerund? I say that analytics is a gerund because uh, it's not something you have, it's something you do. And in lots of corporate contexts, there's this notion of essentially purchasing an asset and then getting a return on that asset, or building an asset and getting a return on that asset. And that is very workable in many contexts. But analytics is not something where if you just go out and buy the software platform one time or hire the consultant, then you have it indefinitely. You have to actually do the work. You have to perform analysis in order to have analytics. And so it's very important to me that the paradigm be, this is not something you just buy and pull off the shelf. This is an active pursuit. And so the question becomes, who is actually doing that active pursuit? And how is that going to sustain into the future in order to have that? So that's the first point. Analytics is a gerund. And then if you say, okay, if you buy into that notion that analytics is made of analysis, then you say, okay, what are the activities that define analysis? And I would argue you can basically categorize all of it into one or a combination of the following three buckets. We observe, we relate, and we predict. And so when we're talking about the decision improvement that I talked about earlier, prediction is in service. In fact, all of these are in service of that. But ideally, we could say, if we make this choice to turn left, then we can expect the following things to happen. That's what we get from prediction. Well, we can't predict if we don't understand the relationship between the different component parts. And we can't relate things that we can't observe. So when we say we'd like to be able to enhance this decision, we start with some very fundamental questions, which is, can we even see what's going on? Do we understand the relationship between the moving parts? And then if so, can we actually get to the point where we can predict what's likely to happen based on a series of empiric evidence? So that's sort of the framework there for defining analytics and having all of those things fall into those categories. So that's what analytics is. What does it take to actually provide quality analysis within an organization? It's one thing to talk about this sort of theoretically, but you actually have to have a series of things firing in order to actually produce the work at quality. And so my framework for this, I call the analytic stack. Um, at the bottom, you've got what hardware are you running on. So that could be literally the laptop versus the server versus the cloud instance. It could be EC2 with AWS, or it could just be the AMD processor in someone's computer. So do you have the right hardware available for whatever it is you're trying to accomplish? How's your data architected? Many of you, I'm sure, know that data architecture can make your life much easier or much harder. Data accessibility, can you actually get to it? And I would also include in that data quality. So if you can get to the data, but the data is poor quality, then I would still call that an accessibility issue. You have a problem getting access to quality data. Analytic tools, what tools are you using? Analytic talent, who's using those tools? And then ultimately translation, communication, and operation. So what does that mean? Translation is the business comes to you and says, we want to understand this thing, or we want to know this thing, or we want to decide this thing. Translating that into the analytic approach is the translation. Then you perform the analysis. Communication is communicating back to the business. And then operation is all the ways that you embed that into existing operations, whether those are tech systems or processes, et cetera. And one of the reasons why I talk about this framework is depending on what company you work at, your leadership may have varied levels of understanding about the ways in which these things sort of below the waterline are in your way. So you may have an outstanding analyst or a group of analysts or team of analysts that can do translation, communication, operation, they could do the analysis, but you've got a data architecture that's making everything take 3 times longer than it should. And so depending on your company and depending on the sort of level of understanding that your leadership has, especially when we're talking about budget season, some of those things you want to be able to draw a line between those things that are in the way and being able to provide the answers and insights and automations that they're looking for. And just to make this even more explicit, at one point I had a gentleman working for me who who basically took a series of 3 executive questions. This is when I was at Best Buy. It was the head of US retail, it was the head of the merchants, and one other executive. So these are top level executives of the company with a series of questions. Oh, I know the third one was the chief marketing officer. And they had each asked questions that we struggled to answer. And we basically said, here are those 3 questions. Here are the data elements we would need in order to answer those questions well. Here's how those data elements are currently organized and why it's extremely difficult to answer those very straightforward questions. And in our opinion, it should not be that difficult, but we have to invest in basically connecting between the data all the way up to the question. So we tried to draw these lines as clearly as we could so that we could get investment in some of those foundational capabilities. So that's another thing that can be, hugely important. And, to me, the theme there is really about education. The last piece here that I want to mention in terms of frameworks under the do good work part is something called the trust equation. So, leave it to the analytics folks to turn something in the relationship space into a math equation. But I do think this is an extremely helpful framework to think about when it comes to trying to drive change in our organization. Trust equals credibility times intimacy divided by risk. So what do we mean by that? Well, credibility is, do you do what you say? Do you say what you do? And are you actually adding value? So when we talk about doing good work, we're really talking about bolstering credibility. Then you've got the intimacy piece, and we're going to talk about that even more a little bit later, but does someone understand your intent? Have you taken time to understand their circumstance, what their pain points are, what keeps them up at night? Are you showing up with a certain degree of empathy? And are you someone that's not just the name at the bottom of an email address to that other person? So when you combine those things, trust goes up. And then you divide that by risk. Now, risk can be real or it can be perceived. And so if you're actually trying something super new as a company or as a program or as a department, the risk can be very real. And you're only going to get sign off on that if they believe that your credibility times your intimacy is bigger than that. But it could also be perceived. It could be that you're showing up and saying, hey, we developed this predictive model. You have always done this with your gut, but we think we might have a better way. You are presenting perceived risk to them in terms of their value in the organization. It's long been my goal to drive change, profitable growth into a company and change. And when you drive change, you introduce risk. And so over the long arc of time that I spend in a company, one of the things I try to be extremely mindful about is making sure that I'm building credibility and intimacy, not only myself, but my entire team, how they show up with our business partners. And the reason for this is because we're going to want to introduce risk from time to time. We're going to want to show up and say, we think we've got a better way of doing a given thing. And we can only get away with that when we've established enough credibility and intimacy. So in my opinion, I actually want to drive risk up uh, through those changes, through those improvements, either real or perceived. And I get away with that over time by increasing credibility and intimacy. So with that, let's summarize doing good work. Number one, you earn the right to be esoteric and abstract by being tangible and impactful. In other words, solve real problems. I love geeking out about nested Laplace approximation as much as the next analytic leader. But you don't always need to use the most complicated methodologies. And just because a problem is intellectually fascinating doesn't mean it's going to add a lot of real business value. And that to me fundamentally is sort of what separates us from academia, right? In academia, if it's just a really interesting problem, that is a good enough reason to go down that road. But in the private sector, it's really about solving real problems. Number two, now that said, you get the right to pursue some of those more abstract problems by actually solving the real ones first. Second, always seek parsimonious approaches. Sometimes an Excel spreadsheet is really all that's needed. And so while there are lots of cases where far more advanced techniques, your latest XG Boost or machine learning methodology may be necessary, you don't want to pull that out just because you can, especially if it's going to make it more difficult for the business to understand what you did. So always seek parsimony in your approach. Number three, make sure that the business value part of your portfolio is at least twice as big as the capability enhancement parts of your portfolio. I mentioned that before, but basically, uh, the business will support investing in your capability enhancements a lot more if they see all of the value that's coming out of the team. Number four, make sure it's never too long between productive outputs that can be shared with the business. So that's back to the singles, doubles, triples, home runs thing. If you don't have anything coming out of the team for really long periods of time, folks may start to wonder what it is that you've been up to. So by mixing that, it really helps handle that situation. And then, of course, my last point, just be outstanding at your craft. The better you are at performing the work, uh, the easier it is for the work to be good. And so the doing good work is meant to both mean, as a reminder, that the work matters. That's one form of that it is good work to be done and that it's done well. So that's sort of the summary on doing good work. With that, I want to jump into the second step, which is tell people about the work. So what does that mean? Well, let's just start with the fact that it's easier to market good products than lousy products. So these two halves of this advice or this framework work together very naturally because it's a lot easier to talk about the work when the work is good. Much harder when it's less good. So let's talk about what does that mean to sort of market good products. And I know that some folks are actually formalizing sort of analytic product leaders or teams, and that's one approach that you can do organizationally. We don't currently do that here, but I certainly understand the inclination. My only concern is that the product folks have to really know their stuff in terms of being able to do some of the translation and communication pieces. But if they can do that, then that can be part of the solution here. So when you think like a marketer, there's a couple things you think, the couple lenses you look through. One is, what are your audience segments, and how is the messaging and the media of delivery to those segments different across them? So, you've got leadership, executive leadership, mid-level management, line level, which is sort of everyone, finance, its own special case because they're controlling the purse strings and purse strings. And if you're heading into budget season, you definitely want them on your side. And then IT, and again, this depends on your structure. So in my company, I report into the business side of the house. I report to our president and COO. I don't report into IT. So IT is a critical partner, and having them understand why what we're doing matters helps garner resources and support and collaboration with that group. So those are audience segments. Then you've got media. So how are you actually delivering the messaging? Well, there's learning or networking communities, leadership meeting presentations, small group leadership meetings, videos produced and posted on your intranet or internally, putting together, hosting events, printed or digital documents, and one-on-one meetings. So we're going to get into some examples of each of these. So this was an example of a leadership meeting. We have a biannual leadership meeting twice a year. We fly folks in from around the country, and very commonly I'll present on a couple of themes. And this was one a few years ago when I was trying to address what I saw coming in the future, which was more and more predictive models, more and more automation, and AI starting to have huge influences on how folks were doing their work at our company. I wanted to get out in front of that and have the paradigm not be the machines are going to take away, but rather that sort of man or woman or person plus machine was actually going to be what the future actually looked like. So we were sort of going with this theme of winning with the machines. Learning and networking community. So this handsome gentleman on the left is Robert Stevens. He was the founder of Geek Squad, which Best Buy purchased years ago, and I got to spend time with him when I was working there. He's really, really brilliant guy. One of his sort of genius elements was his sort of natural intuitions about marketing and his creation of sort of the Geek Squad look and feel and ethos. But the reason why I put him in the slide is that when I was at Best Buy, I wanted to gather together a group that was cross-functional. We had different analytic groups. I was in the customer analytics, but we had real estate analytics, we had finance, we had merchandising, we had inventory. So there's like all these different teams all over the place, plus all the data and infrastructure teams that supported them. And I told him that, I was getting this group together, and he said, "God, I love you, you analytic types. You're always predicting stuff. You know what's gonna happen before it happens. You're like the Psychic Friends Network." And I was like, that's it. He just named this group. So I used to get this group together on a quarterly basis that was called the Psychic Friends Network. And we would share, we give presentations to one another and share what we were up to and what we've been working on and issues and concerns, and frankly just getting to know one another. I mean, I'll never forget the time I was in one of those meetings when someone introduced themselves and someone else said, "Oh, you're Matt," because he was a database administrator who granted access or didn't grant access to a bunch of the servers that were used by the analyst community. So it was great to get that together. On the right hand side, I have my very simplistic space shuttle icon, which is what I use for our current learning community, which is called Launchpad at Echo. And so it consists of my team, members of the finance reporting team, members of the data team from IT, product, engineering, members of the business. It's open to anyone who's interested, but the topics are analytics and sort of related areas. And we get together on a monthly basis. It's a hybrid meeting, so there's an in-person component and an online component, and it's an opportunity for folks to present about their work. I'm basically trying to provide a platform for folks that are doing good work to tell people about their work. And that includes my team, but not only my team, other teams as well. So those are just a couple of examples of creating communities like that. And this is another slide that I stole from my orientation deck, where I'm talking about us, strategic analytics resources, supporting across all these different groups and departments. I talked about that earlier, and that we develop an analytic network within and outside of Echo. And that's what this is down here. This is basically the Launchpad network. So it's inclusive of all these other folks. I often have guest speakers also speak to the group from universities or non-competing companies, things like that, to get outside perspectives. Recorded videos. So this has become easier than ever, which is really, I think, a great step forward. So if I have to explain, this was me explaining how our suggested assignment queue worked. And so it was a model that we developed and released, and not everybody wanted to know the details of how it worked, but some people did. And so we wanted to make that really readily accessible. At that time, we were using an intranet service called Workplace that was by Facebook, but many of you may have different means of sharing internal videos. Speaking of which, I'm going to show you a brief video about an event. And so I love doing these kinds of events in person, although I think this has become a little bit more challenging in the sort of hybrid virtual universe. This took place before the pandemic. But this is just a little bit of an example of one that we put together, and it had a very sort of science fair feeling on purpose. By the way, I'm going to stop sharing right quick and reshare because I realized I don't think I turned my sound on for it. So let me do that. Okay, here we go.
This idea started with a class in SQL, and so this began as an idea, as a celebration of those skills. it's really powerful to see folks that are passionate about the work they're doing share that work, to feel empowered with new skills and new information. And I really think it speaks to our company values. I think that all of the participants in this event, both on the presenter side, but as well as on the audience side, are really sort of living the bring your own company value, as well as the better's knowing option. I kind of feel like this is a bit of a celebration of both of those. Yeah, we welcome anyone that's interested in data analytics reporting. It's sort of a learning community that's cross-functional, cross-departmental. Yeah, it's a great group to get to know and learn from, and also share your knowledge with.
So that was an event we put together in 2017 called Datapalooza, and it was based on the fact that we were teaching a SQL course internally to a bunch of users. And my head of data science, Jeffrey Simmons, reached out to me and said, "Hey, you should see the projects that folks are working on. They're really terrific. They're doing a lot of really great business value add stuff." And he sent me the list, and I was like, "You're absolutely right. Like we gotta tell people about this." And in that video, they didn't have name tags on, but the CEO, the president and COO, head of HR, head of IT, were all there at that event learning about the work that those folks had done and recognizing, all that great work. Oh, we did that already. Here's another event that we put together. This is for our Echo Idea Expo. It always helps, by the way, some treats. I don't know if you caught the donut in the shot from the Datapalooza. At this one, we did ice cream sundaes. Always helps to feed people to get attendance. And then printed materials. This is a cover page from an annual report that we put together in 2007. This is a long time ago now, back when there used to be paper. But it was meant to show the ROI and the investment performance in the Lean Six Sigma program. I was in the first class of black belts at Best Buy, and one of the things we wanted to share as that program continued to develop and evolve and receive investment in both sort of dollars and labor was, what kind of return were we getting on that? And so we put together an actual printed annual report that was based on the idea of an actual public company annual report. And then last thing here, one-on-one meetings. So I talked about the trust equation. When you're doing these one-on-one meetings, you've got opportunities to accomplish multiple things at the same time. One of those things is telling people about the good work. The other thing is developing the intimacy, understanding what's going on in their world, understanding how what you're working on may or may not relate to their needs, and looking for those opportunities to pick up work that could meaningfully make a difference in their part of the business. All right, let's just touch on measurement tactics. So when you're sharing this work, it's important to understand how you're going to measure, how you're going to talk about benefits from the work that you've been performing. I want to start with the fact that I lean heavily on a framework that I learned from Lean Six Sigma, because Lean Six Sigma was pretty focused on measuring the benefits of the projects. And it had, I thought, an extremely useful framework for doing that. So the first is that there's 4 different benefit types. And we're going to go into each of those 4. There's the measurement of the benefit types. You want to involve finance if you can, get their sort of sign off on whatever measurement you've done, how and why you've done it the way you've done it. Because if you get finance to say, yes, we agree with that, it adds a tremendous amount of credibility. And then you do have to deal with some subjective circumstances involving leaders that may say, oh, you guys, your predictive model or your analysis said we should turn left. I was going to turn left anyway. There's a bunch of different ways to handle that. There's not one universal answer. If you find yourself in that situation, it might be worth reaching out to IIA to get a call, to get an expert to chat through that circumstance. The other challenging situation is what I call gear slippage, which is to say the analysis says turn left, and they kind of turn a little bit left, but they don't turn as left as the analysis said they should. So you basically have slippage between what the actual recommendation was and what the human ultimately did. Those are some gray areas. But to try to keep it as black and white as possible, these are the 4 quadrants of the Lean Six Sigma benefit matrix. So along the bottom axis, you've got operating income or economic value add impact. Those were the financial frameworks that were being used at Best Buy at the time, years ago. That could be EBITDA, that could be gross profit. Your company will have its own sort of important financial measures that you're after, but type 1 and type 3 are financial in nature. Type 2 and type 4 tend to be non-financial in nature or non-EBITDA in nature. They may involve improving capital or cost avoidance as opposed to cost out, for example. And then you've got on the y-axis your ability to prove the project solution drove the benefits. In other words, how much of a straight line can you draw between the work that you performed and the outputs that happened? If there are many steps in between and a bunch of layers, then you're going to be in the type 2, type 4 side. If you can say, for example, a nice clean one was my team developed a predictive model on truckload costs. And as a result, we've done a bunch of digital quoting. And as a result of the digital quoting, we've got loads that we wouldn't have otherwise won. So that's a very clean, type 1 type benefit. Just noticed that I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to scoot through that and jump onto my summary here. So telling people about the work. Number one, you got to work within your company's culture. I'm aware, for example, that at Amazon, they're big on everyone bringing written materials to their meetings, and the first 10 minutes are spent reading that. So you definitely want to work within that kind of framework in terms of the medium that you're putting together with information about your team's work. Think like a small, scrappy business that can't afford big advertising. What would they do? How would they get creative about letting people know what they're up to? Educate, educate, educate. Chances are you're a subject matter expert that knows more about this space than others, but the more you can spread that, the more appreciation there will be for what you're doing. Mix big moments with small moments. So sometimes it's just a one-on-one meeting. Sometimes it's a big event like the Datapalooza event that we did. Not putting all your eggs in one basket from a sort of internal marketing standpoint is just as valuable as having a portfolio approach to the work itself that we were describing before. And then you want to be rigorous and habitual in your impact level, in your impact measurement. So I talked about the 4 quadrant matrix. You want to try to always be measuring your impact. I will say, though, that can become time consuming. You have to be careful to not burn too much time measuring the work that you're doing, because that's going to reduce the amount of actual output coming out of the team. So typically what I like to say is the higher your trust level within the organization, the less time you have to spend doing all of that measurement. So to recap, to establish and justify value, to support your budget requests, do good work, tell people about the work. And with that, I thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, I think we have time for one question here, Scott. A good one, going back to the market conversation and perceived value, perceived performance versus actual performance. So Eric, one value component that she keeps in mind when prioritizing projects is the sizzle factor, the ability to tell a great story. Is this perceived performance or the storytelling component of actual performance?
It can be both. So, I mean, it can be either. There are projects that have an inherent sizzle because of executive interest, for example. And sometimes you can do that on purpose, and sometimes you just get lucky that you happen to be working on a thing that gets a bunch of attention. And then there's other times when you can sort of add more sizzle factor based on how robustly you present it. So for example, the expo idea came from back at Lean Six Sigma when we did expos for Lean Six Sigma projects. And one of my favorite ever was we had this data privacy problem where we had to make sure we destroyed customer hard drives so that they couldn't be used, maliciously by someone after we repaired a laptop. and they developed literally a machine that they call La Machine that like crushed. So you had this big lever and you put a hard drive in and you crushed it. Well, they brought that machine to the expo that normally lived at the like repair facility depot so that executives and people, middle management, all these people could like crush these hard drives. And it had this sort of wow factor of like, oh wow, like we are doing what's needed to take care of our customers by making sure their data stays private. And I got to participate in it by crushing a hard drive, which is an incredibly satisfying thing to do if you've never done it. And so it definitely gave that sort of pizzazz, sort of a sizzle factor to what it otherwise is like could have felt like kind of a blasé project, like, oh, customer data privacy, like, is that very exciting? It's like, yeah, it is, and we're like, we made it exciting. So yes, I completely agree that there's a sizzle factor that can be taken into effect, and it can also affect your decision on the project. So if there's a project that might not return quite as much real value, but is going to get a lot of visibility and there's a lot of positive hype about, you might fold that into your portfolio. You just don't want that to become dominant because you don't want all sizzle and no steak.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. Yeah, great example too. Okay, all right. So we're at time. Thanks everybody for hanging on. Again, we'll be sharing the recording and slides of the webinar in an upcoming email, and it will also be available on our website. Please take just 1 second to give feedback on the session. It really helps us develop timely and relevant content for the community. Stay tuned on our email and social channels for tools and resources and other content to help you rethink how to capture and communicate analytics and AI value. As mentioned at the top of the session, a good place to start is our ROI Resource Hub, which answers questions like why doesn't traditional ROI capture the real value of analytics? What's a better way to define and measure analytics value? How do you measure value when analytics is federated? What does it mean to make smarter bets with analytics? The Hub has exclusive roundtable peer insights as well as key takeaways from real expert exchanges. And we look forward to seeing everybody in October at our analytics symposium. And on that note, onward and upward, everybody, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks again, Scott. Appreciate it.
Thank you.